All right. Hello, everyone. First to the judges, thank you for being here and judging today. We appreciate it. I think there's one competitor here. Congratulations. We're going to be live streaming this round. Is there anyone who, for any reason, does not consent to being live streamed?
No.
Alrighty. Fantastic. I'm going to wait here for everyone else to filter in. Alrighty, and then I've been asked to remind judges one more thing. I'm said to remind you to keep your cameras on during the round. We thank you for doing that. Sorry, the Kentucky team is currently working on getting here. They're having some slight technical issues, and then we should be able to get this round started. All right, it looks like we have half of Kentucky. And is that the other half of Kentucky?
I'm here.
Okay. Yep, we have everyone we need here to start the round. So once again, I'd like to ask judges to keep their cameras on throughout the debate, just as students are speaking. Of course, you can turn them off during prep time. I understand that. And then the other thing I would like to ask from everyone is make sure you mute yourself if you are not actively speaking, because otherwise the camera is going to focus on you sitting there and nodding your head. And I don't think you want that. So make sure you're muting yourself. From there, have a good round. Congratulations to everyone for being here. And thank you to our wonderful judges for judging today.
Do we know if sides are locked?
I saw that there was a flip on tab, so probably not.
Okay, we went ahead and chose our sides.
Okay, I'm just pulling that up here. Okay. All right, we've chosen our side.
Okay, and then is it all right with the judges if we ask a few questions before we get started?
Sure.
So for like weighing mechanisms, is there anything that you would prefer, or like setting up a weighing mechanism?
I know personally I'm pretty open to whatever you are most comfortable with doing.
Default to policymaker unless told otherwise.
Yep, whatever y'all want to do, just make sure you actually articulate it in the first speech.
Okay, that was my only question. So we're ready whenever you are.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, I'm about to start now. My partner and I affirm, resolve to win in conflict, democracy should prioritize isolation over engagement when responding to human rights abuses by authoritarian regimes. Contention 1 is appeasement. Diplomacy is just a pretext for appeasement, which only exacerbates human rights abuses. An empirical analysis in 2020 by Deborah of Maastricht University finds that autocratic states exploit regionalism to boost domestic region security, noting that creating diplomatic ties increases the survivability of authoritarian regimes. They explain such ties strengthen executive capacity of autocratic incumbent elites to execute survival strategies vis-a-vis internal and external challengers. They further that when political unrest occurs, these relations provide incumbents with crucial material, informational, and ideational boosts to increase the chances of holding on to the reins of power. Indeed, Day et al. 21 explains that peace building enables authoritarianism in two ways. One is by providing material support to governments in ways that strengthen centralized regimes, and two, by sending political signals to leadership about the cost of authoritarian behavior. Appeasement only strengthens authoritarian regimes, giving them more power to oppress. Indeed, Taylor and Friends 15 explained that authoritarian leaders adopt the facade of democracy that enables them to maintain international and domestic legitimacy. These cosmetic alterations don't change political outcomes for citizens, but instead gives false hope, which entices the international community to invest with aid and keep the regime afloat. This is empirically proven, as Jacoby 14 finds that engagement with totalitarian governments only encourages crackdowns, noting detentions in Havana increased by 27%. History has shown us that negotiating with oppressors doesn't work. The Atlantic Council in 2020 asserts that the U.S.'s lax response to Russian aggression against Crimea was insubstantial insofar as it inadvertently legitimized Putin's imperialist grievances. This ineffective response could also be partially responsible for enabling Russia's current attacks on Ukraine. Contention 2 is imposing negative incentives. Even the threat of sanctions is enough to change behavior. The Atlantic in 2022 reports that, for example, the U.S. was incredibly effective at forcing Iran to follow the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty by using threats of sanctions as a deterrent tactic. If the threat of sanctions fails, states must be willing to impose sanctions on authoritarian regimes to incentivize changed behavior. There are 3 different types of strategic sanctions. First is targeted sanctions. Kohler and Eckenfeld's Garcia 15 note that sanctions such as asset freezing or suspension from international or regional organizations can be used to cut off outside support, which reduces the overall strength of the regime. They further that these increasingly precise measures may have a significant impact while minimizing harm to innocent populations. Further, Shagabutinova and Barajikian 2007 concludes in an analysis that the use of smart sanctions are empirically effective at improving human rights conditions, and smart sanctions have worked before. Lopez 12 explains that by cutting off nearly half of Gaddafi's usable money, smart sanctions played a considerable role in degrading both the regime's firepower and its support among Libyan elites. Second is arms embargo. Thoreau 18 finds that empirically arms sales increase the propensity for conflict. Arms sales exacerbate ongoing genocide and conflict, such as in South Sudan, when democratic countries were providing the government with military weaponry during the civil war that led to 400,000 deaths. In 2018, the UN imposed an arms embargo, and Tupper in 2021 explains that it has been crucial in reducing human rights violations. Third is conventional sanctions with humanitarian exceptions. Haas of Brookings EDU argues that humanitarian exceptions should be included as part of any comprehensive sanctions. Innocents should not be made to suffer more than absolutely necessary. Thus, Suckbake 08 concludes in an empirical analysis that sanctions contribute to a decrease in individual human rights violations, and that economic sanctions have become a collective part of the international community's efforts to reduce human rights abuses. Thus, I affirm.
Okay, give me a second to upload our doc really quick.
Oh, I can put ours in too.
Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. Just a second. Okay, it should be up there now. All right, then is everyone ready? Okay. Get my timer set up. We negate the resolution resolved. When in conflict, democracy should prioritize isolation over engagement when responding to human rights abuses by authoritarian regimes. Framework is net benefits. Contention 1 is engage North Korea. North Korea is being isolated now. Engagement is key to de-escalation, reintegration, deterrence, and denuclearization. Amin Jasper 21. As Biden's North Korea policy reviews near completion, there is growing worry that it could dig its heels on North Korea's behavior through isolation. This approach will continue to fail because it incorrectly assumes that North Korea will yield its coercive tactics. Maintaining deterrence and preserving denuclearization as a long-term goal are essential. A practical approach to U.S. and regional security should maximize interacting with North Korea. Greater and more meaningful interaction can help reduce miscommunication, miscalculation, build mutual trust, and contribute to North Korea becoming a more responsible, stable, and integrated, bold, proactive outreach. Could incentivize North Korea to return to talks and reach an interim deal that freezes its nuclear program without coercion. Humanitarian engagements offer low-hanging fruit and should be invigorated immediately. U.S. engagement can encourage domestic growth and stability, which would help improve North Korea and facilitate the country's integration into the global economy. And isolation isn't working, and it's intensifying human rights abuses. Engagement is the only way. Schlein 2022. A UN investigator is calling for an end to the North Korea's international isolation. Warning continued an exclusion that will prolong the country's worsening human rights violations. A new escalation intentions are that the North Korean peninsula could rapidly and dangerously destabilize the region. A diplomatic approach towards peace and denuclearization, which build upon previous negotiations and is combined with proactive engagement on the human rights situations, is the only way forward. If the current situation persists, vulnerable populations may face acute hunger and starvation. And North Korea is becoming more aggressive and has begun testing ICBMs again. They're escalating now. The risk of miscalc grows every day. Patterson 2022. North Korea said it will use nuclear weapons in retaliation for any South Korean attack. The warning followed recent comments from South Korea about potential preemptive strikes. The warning comes from a fear grows from over recent long-range ballistic missile tests in North Korea, a brazen violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Last week, Pyongyang successfully test-fired a missile that was capable of carrying multiple nuclear warheads and hitting the U.S. Contingent 2 is engaged the Middle East. Ukraine stalemates Russia now. The war has become one of attrition, and the longer Russia stays afloat, the greater the risks. Due to 22. In Ukraine, two wars neither side has the upper hand, and what is becoming static war of attrition. What was supposed to be a lightning hit Russian ground incursion has shuddered halt. Russia's top army commanders on Friday said that the war had entered a new phase. It is clear that most parts of the Russian offensive are now bogged down. Western officials and analysts say that Russia's forces may be reaching the so-called point of accumulation. U.S. needs to be focused on engaging Middle East. Isolation of key regimes guarantees an Arab pivot to Russia. During 22. The Russian invasion of Ukraine marked the most significant escalation by Russia. The Kremlin also returned to the Middle East. Russia's return to the Middle East was met with fears that it would reemerge as a hostile actor against U.S. interests, and the recent invasion of Ukraine may give those fears a greater sense of urgency. However, Russia seems to seek the set of the rules of the game and break American-European exclusivity. The Middle East is a crucial player in this new Russian plot. The threat of a pivot to Russia by Arab countries is always there to remind the U.S. not to stray away from past decades of historical alliances and cooperation between the Arab states and the United States. And U.S. engagement through arms sales choke Russia. Russia fills in and revives its military. Cavalry 2018. A smart arms transfer policy would strangle both Russia and China, which is trying to take place. Russia in particular needs arms exports to fund its aggressive but underfunded military. It is in America's interest to choke off a large percentage of Russia's export market as possible. And Putin is creating a blueprint for genocide in Ukraine. Dickinson 22. In order to create the Russified Ukraine he dreams of, Putin will need to pacify or remove the vast majority of the population. The risk of genocide in Ukraine is now very real. Putin has crossed almost every imaginable red line and turned his country into an overnight pariah. He will pursue his criminal ambitions with an increasing recklessness that reflects his growing desperations. It is for those reasons that I would ask for a negative ballot in today's debate. And I'm open for cross-ex.
Okay, I'm also open for cross. Can I ask the first question?
Sure, just let me get my timer set up, and whenever you're ready.
So how has engagement with the Middle East helped? Because recently with the deal between the Taliban and the United States, that led to what we see now in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking over and infringing on individual freedom. So how exactly did engagement benefit us in that scenario?
Yeah, so that's not what we're talking about. We're specifically talking about like keeping our power in the Middle East, because when we leave from the Middle East, Russia will fill in and create more human rights abuses.
Your second contention is about engaging the Middle East though, right?
Yeah, so that's like the specific way we engage in the Middle East. Can I have a question?
Sure.
So first on your sanctions contentions, who are we talking about an arms embargo with?
On which contention is that?
Your second contention under smart sanctions, your arms embargo.
Yes. What did you ask me?
Who is the arms embargo with?
The arms embargo was with South Sudan, I believe.
Okay.
When
Do
we
you,
had,
do you have a question?
Can you explain how U.S. engagement through arms is choking Russia right now? I think your second contention said something along those lines.
Sure. So my partner will bring that up in his next speech, but basically what we're talking about is how we need to create arms sales within the Middle East so that Russia doesn't fill in and create more human rights abuses. In your second contention, can you just explain what smart sanctions are? Like, are they conditional?
Excuse me?
Are smart sanctions conditional sanctions?
They can be, huh?
Can you give examples, I guess?
Well, we have smart sanction Russia. Do you want the definition or examples? Like, you've asked me like 3 different questions.
Yeah, so what kind of like sanctions are smart sanctions is what I'm asking.
Smart sanctions are targeted sanctions that are specifically against like leaders. So the whole point of them is to minimize harm at the grassroots level.
So it's like economic sanctions or like...
They can be economic.
Okay,
Yeah,
it can be anything.
they're
Okay.
predominantly economic.
Okay, do you have a question?
You all mentioned that engagement with North Korea would, I guess, limit some of their aggression with testing. However, we have engaged with North Korea in the past and they still tested. So how exactly would engagement help us?
So when we engaged in the past, specifically in the Trump era, we saw that they actually did start denuclearizing. But when the Biden era comes in, like that's our Almond Jasper and our Slime 22 card, and Biden's administration, we saw that when we had a policy of isolation with North Korea, that's when they began to build their nuclear arsenal up. So that's why engagement is the only way with North Korea. Can you explain like what like conventional sanctions are and why you can have like a subset like where we have humanitarian efforts, so like we engage humanitarianly?
Well, in this event, we will be listing sanctions because we want to address that country's human rights abuses. So we wouldn't just give general sanctions that would lead to an increase in human rights abuses. We know with sanctions, they harm the grassroots.
Okay, you can finish if you would like. That's okay.
Okay, they harm the grassroots level. So with humanitarian exceptions, they would just make sure that the people can have food and medicine, essentially.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna run like 30 seconds of prep. All right, that's 23 seconds used. And I'm just going to start my timer. So off-time roadmap, order's going to be pro then con. Con then pro. Yeah. So is everyone good to go? Is there anyone who's not good? All right. Start on their first contention about North Korea and understand that engagement is direct appeasement. That's our Day et al. 21 evidence that explains that peace building is going to enable the authoritarianism in North Korea by providing material support to governments that strengthen centralized regimes and sending political signals to leadership about the cost of authoritarian behavior. By engaging with North Korea, they're not doing anything to solve the problem. What they are doing is they are enabling this regime to continue. And Taylor and France 15, in our case, explain that when they tell you that authoritarian leaders adopt a facade of democracy that enables them to maintain international and domestic legitimacy. Now, they specifically cite our negotiations with North Korea in the Trump era of how North Korea is like willing to cooperate with democratic regimes. But that's exactly what they were doing. They were adopting this facade of democracy in order to maintain their international legitimacy. They also talk about like how incredibly important it's going to be to reduce human rights abuses in North Korea, like by having these diplomatic engagement. But the thing is that that's only going to encourage crackdowns. That's our Jacoby 14 evidence, which tells you that when engagement with totalitarians only increases crackdowns on their own populace. They also talk about like how we need to reduce this isolation, specifically that we've caused in North Korea. But North Korea has isolated themselves historically. It's not democracies or the international diplomatic stage that is isolating North Korea. North Korea is isolating itself. But next, move on to their second contention about engagement in the Middle East, specifically their Cavalry 18 evidence. They tell you about how we need to crack down on the arms sales to Russia and other countries. That's exactly what we advocate for in our second contention. We advocate specifically for arms embargoes. We tell you specifically in our Thrall 18 evidence about how like these arms sales are going to increase conflicts, and in our Tutpur evidence about that example with that South Sudan arms embargo. So they tell you that we need to like choke the amount of weapons that we're giving to Russia, which is exactly why in our second contention we advocate for an arms embargo. That is a form of isolation. If they want to have this like decrease in arms sales and they want to choke Russia like they claim in their second contention, the only way that you do that is through an isolationist approach of arms embargoes. That's exactly what we advocate for in our case. But next, on to the pro case. So first, we tell you about like how lax responses on other countries have led to current problems that we have with military engagement. Specifically, we give you that Atlantic 20 evidence, which tells you that as a result of like lax policies against Russia during the Crimea crisis, it ended up exhibiting what we're seeing in Ukraine today. So when we don't have this isolationist sort of approach, we're just enabling these countries to continue to commit these human rights atrocities. That's exactly what our appeasement point is about. By not cracking down and isolating these countries and by engaging with them diplomatically, you are just enabling them to continue their human rights abuses. We also tell you about how important negative and sanctions are because they are pretty much the only way to force countries to do things. We tell you about smart sanctions, which don't affect people humanitarianly and instead target elites of certain countries. We give you multiple examples of that. We tell you again about the arms embargo, how incredibly important it is to have an arms embargo because as they admit, choking Russia is one of the most important things that we can do to help people humanitarianly. And finally, they talk about we talk about like our conventional sanctions with humanitarian exceptions. That's going to allow us to have all of the great effects of sanctions, which are going to isolate these regimes and like crack down on them, while also allowing like these humanitarian exceptions, while still allowing them to have aid and still allowing them to have food and medication. So for all of the reasons that we advocate for it in our case, both how their diplomatic approach is going to lead to the appeasement of these regimes and how the only way to solve this is through negative incentives, you are going to vote for an AF ballot.
Just give me 1 second to upload the document. No prep. I can do it properly this time. What is this? The AR. Okay, well, we're just going to name it today, I guess. Okay, so it should be in there. It's called 2A BLL. I don't know why BLL. I just like click letters. Oh, I should probably grab my timer. Just a brief off-the-clock roadmap. We'll be going through the negative case, and then we'll go through the affirmative in the order it was presented. So just everything in the doc is just for reference. I'll be signposting as to whether or not I'm reading evidence versus the analytics. Is everybody good? Okay, give me 1 second to reopen the doc, I guess. Which one? Okay, yeah. Oh, that's okay. So that Edelman 2019 card should be applied to contention too. It doesn't matter. I'll get to it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and begin. So first on North Korea, there's a few reasons as to why we're winning on this side of the flow. First, like you're going to turn their coercion argument because Extend Alm and Jasper 21 directly warns that coercion has not worked in the past, and the isolationist policies of sanctions do not work because North Korea simply does not care. And Extend Schlein 22 here, they don't touch it. And this is key to winning the North Korea debate, specifically because it forces North Korea to double down on human rights abuses, which turns their entire case. Also, you prefer our evidence that's specific to North Korea, so that's Schlein 22. Also, you don't prefer the Jacoby card because it literally only mentions Havana. Like it's not specific and it has a small scale example per our example, but also you're specifically preferring the warrant specific, or sorry, I see specific a lot apparently. But you're specifically preferring our warrants here because engagement with North Korea has worked under Trump. Like they literally denuclearized, they were attempting to reintegrate into society, and then Extend Alm Jasper here, which essentially states that once Biden came in, he reimposed isolation. So like also they say that North Korea is isolating itself. However, you're essentially not buying this specifically. Extend Schlein 22. When you isolate North Korea, it forces it to double down on its own isolation. Reintegration is key. That's why you prefer diplomacy and engagement. Let's move into contention 2. I'm actually just not going to read Edelman real quick. But first, they essentially misdiagnose our entire contention here and leave the rest of the flow open. So I'll go ahead and just spend a little bit of time here. Like their misinterpretation is that we are saying that like arms sales to Russia is bad. However, like this is a story of Russia fill-in. We're not actually giving arms to Russia. The issue is that once the United States pulls out from the Middle East, that's Drury 22, like it guarantees the Arab pivot to Russia. Russia comes in and fills in with its own arms. Extend Cavalry 18 here. They don't touch it in any meaningful way. Specifically, again, there's that word. United States engagement through arms sales chokes Russia. Why does it choke Russia? Because Russia like finances its military through a lot of arms sales. So if they're unable to access the Middle East because we're there right now, then like their military just falls. Again, once they once we pull out and Russia fills in, that essentially just revitalizes their military. That's Cavalry 18 again. Extend Dickinson 22 though. However, like, it goes untouched. Putin is creating a blueprint for genocide in Ukraine, and because it goes untouched, and we win a link here specifically, like they guarantee through isolation that Russia just ends up Russia ends up just filling in and revitalizing military, which causes the genocide. Let's move into appeasement. First, in the initial parts of the invasion, diplomacy was the only thing that didn't escalate. Rosen Polyak 22. Macron, the first leader of the major Western power to meet Vladimir Putin since Russia mass troops near Ukraine's talks helped prevent the crisis from escalating. And isolation through sanctions has no impact on Russia. Rosen Polyak 22. The European Union threatened Russia with sanctions. Moscow dismissed new sanctions as an empty threat. However, again, I'll go through the analytics real quick. First, diplomacy is not a pretext for appeasement, but rather a pretext for key negotiations. We've seen this with Russia. Extend the Rose 22 card here. Also, we're not appeasing Saudi Arabia. Look specifically there. We are strategically engaging them through defensive arms. I'll get into that in a little bit. Also, like again, there's no arms embargo to Russia. It doesn't exist because we don't give arms to Russia. Like we're just giving you a story of Russia fill-in. Their card has no, they don't have any evidence here. Moving to sanctions. Smart sanctions severely harmed civilians as Gordon at 10. Smart sanctions sought to focus on weapons or assets of the political and military leaders without harming the population as a whole. This claim has certainly not been true with Iran. For example, targeted sanctions reduced funds for the military, but also compromised on all critical public services dependent on state funding. It led to layoffs of civil servants and the personal staffing, electricity generation, water treatment, and telephone system. Teachers, doctors, electrical, educational supplies, and imported medicines from schools and health clinics were all at risk. Cut the card there. Second, actually, we'll just get down into the nitty gritty. So move down to the Ward 21 card. We agree Saudi Arabia genocide should be stopped. That's why we should change our engagement to providing defensive systems. That's Ward 21. The US would stop all above and solely help Saudi Arabia defend against threats. Saudi Arabia pays commercial contractors to keep Saudi warplanes in the air. The US could cancel his contracts, effectively grounding the Saudi Air Force. And Saudi Arabia without a defense is a destroyed country with casualties beneath the rubber. That's Al Jazeera 22. Houthi rebels unleashed a barrage of Saudi Arabia targeting an LNG plant, water desalination plant, oil facility, and power station. Okay. Just give me a second to recut, I guess. That's unfortunate. Okay, there's the newer doc, I think. So it should have everything cut. I'm open across.
All right. Let me just put my timer up.
Yep.
All right. Do you want the first question, or can I take it?
You can have it if you want.
All right. Yeah. So, first on your whole thing about like how we need to engage with North Korea, if we tell you specifically about like countries adopting a facade of democracy in order to look like they're cooperating, but they're actually continuing to crack down on their citizens, how is there like a guarantee that that won't happen in North Korea?
Yeah, so you'll essentially just extend line 22 here. It tells you that isolation specifically with North Korea forces them to double down on the human rights abuses and the repressment. Can I have the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, like, can you just tell me exactly? Oh, sorry, my bad. Yeah. So, can you just tell me, like, where exactly are these arms going to Russia? Because, like, you make this argument that we should embargo arms to Russia, but, like, do you read a card that we're giving arms to Russia?
I mean, like, you specifically talk about like how an arms embargo would choke Russia. Like, in your
But
case.
that's with Saudi Arabia. We're not actually giving.
We can do an arms embargo. We just advocate for arms embargoes in general. We don't specifically advocate for an arms embargo in Russia. We can arms embargo Saudi Arabia. That's a great idea. Let's arms embargo Saudi Arabia.
No. Do you want the next question?
Yeah, sure. So you like have this whole thing about how like these diplomacy was like the only thing that didn't escalate this conflict, right? But like we tell you specifically that like it's just going to like allow these authoritarian regimes to bolster themselves. So how is that not going to like escalate conflict?
So there's like two different responses. First, all of your evidence is severely generic and not case specific. Like Russia should be case specific because it's large scale, and this situation with Ukraine is extremely new. And B, specifically, like we tell you, like we provide you evidence of specific to Russia how diplomacy did not escalate and how engaging with the Middle East can starve the Russian military. Can I have the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so like if the only like issue with Saudi Arabia and its arms is that they utilize offensive weaponry to kill Yemenis, what's the issue with giving them defensive weapons to defend themselves?
I mean, we tell you like giving arms to countries like ends up increasing conflict. Like that's our Thal 18 evidence. Like even if there's like an underlying thing there, like they're giving arms to countries increases conflict. I would also say that while defensive like weapons could potentially like do stuff like that, I would say that the greater effect would be creating this arms embargo against Saudi Arabia and ensuring that they don't have the weapons in the first place to like kill Yemeni civilians.
Can I have a follow-up real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so like can you just tell me how defensive weapons are used to kill people? Like if they're only used to stop missile attacks?
I mean, I think you're misunderstanding my answer to your question here.
No. Can you just like answer the question? How do you use defensive weapons to kill people?
I mean, they are weapons. They kill.
Okay, you got it. Did you want a question?
Yeah, actually, there's like 6 seconds left. I'm fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take prep time. Okay, I'm ready to start. 1 second. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with our case and then I'm going to move on to the con case, starting now. So we've stressed throughout this entire round that authoritarian regimes can create a facade of democracy in order to entice democracies to engage with them and give them economic aid or anything else that would benefit their respective agendas. This evidence is given to you in our contention 1 by Taylor and France 15, which stressed that a facade of democracy would be a grave enabler to human rights abuses. They state that engagement worked with the Trump Organization. However, we've already seen that North Korea has since then rebounded into a more nuclear testing and more human rights abuses. And even when we engage with them through the Trump administration, they were still abusing human rights. So that is not topical to our discussion. North Korea has always abused human rights, and us engaging with them has not mitigated that whatsoever. They also have no response to our conventional sanctions with humanitarian exceptions. And this is very important because humanitarian exceptions make sure that human rights decrease, which is what this resolution is about. We are deciding whether or not we should engage or isolate with authoritarian regimes in an attempt to decrease human rights abuses. They have no response to this. Conventional sanctions with human rights abuses would also have the robustness of a general sanction, but would do that without harming innocent populations that have no accountability to their leadership. And that's in our second contention. That is from, yes, that's the third type of sanction from Haas of Brookings EDU. Moving on to their case, they stress that we can choke Russia with an arms embargo because somehow Middle Eastern countries would use Russia for arms. However, through our second contention, which is about a second type of sanction called the arms embargo, from Thrall 18, we state that when we give arms to countries that are already having conflict, that leads to more deaths. And when we implement an arms embargo, that decreases it. So we can flip their entire second contention about that because we would be preventing what they claim to prevent, but actually make happen. Just back over to our case a little bit more. The biggest thing throughout it is that they want to engage. We've shown that engagement does not work. It creates a facade of democracy. A facade of democracy would only increase human rights abuses, so they cannot win a debate on a decrease in human rights abuses while implementing things that would only increase it. Finally, just to testify to the saliency of economic sanctions, our Sook-Bake 08 evidence once again states that a collective effort by the international community has been effective in mitigating current human rights abuses because they have a stringent result to them. People actually follow them when they are sanctioned and when they are implemented in an effective manner. Their isolationist approach is only appeasement and will further engage human rights. Thus, we affirm.
I'm going to start running prep now. Stop at 134. And there are no new cards. So just a quick off-the-clock roadmap. We'll do, we're going to go over framework, then we'll go neg, and then AF in order. So first on framework, you prefer the weighing mechanism of net benefits. Whoever has the most benefits within specifically the case-specific evidence and relevance is what you should prefer in today's round, because it is the most relevant in today's world. Now moving on to our first contingent. Again, you extend our Alm and Jasper 21 card. We see that coercion doesn't doesn't work, and so we see that isolation is the status quo. Isolation is the status quo right now, and it's not working. Again, extend Schlein 22. The isolation causes North Korea to double down on human rights abuses. They have not touched this at all. That is the inherent link. Now extend Patterson 22 is that North Korea is becoming more aggressive. Now it's try or die for the negative. We must engage with North Korea. Engagement is the only way. They have not talked about this at all. The only thing they've responded is their Jacoby evidence, but you prefer our evidence because our evidence is case specific. Their Jacoby evidence is one line about Havana. There's nothing else on there. So you prefer Alm and Jasper. Now moving on to contention 2 of Middle East. So you extend Judah 22 is that that's the relevance that Ukraine is stalemating. Now you extend Durian 2022 is that the U.S. needs to focus on the Middle East. Again, they haven't touched any of these. The only thing they touched is our Calverley 18 card, and they have inherently misunderstand this. They say that we're arguing for an arms embargo. We're not arguing for giving Russia arms, and we're not arguing for an arms embargo. We're arguing through smart engagement of giving defensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. And this is important. It's try or die because Russia will fill in the Middle East, and it will revitalize their military. And that goes through into our impact of Dickinson 22 again, which you flow through because Putin is creating a blueprint for genocide. Now this is going 100% uncontested. Genocide is happening in Ukraine now, and this is largely the debate. In order to not have Russia revitalize the military, we have to stop them from filling in the Middle East. This is not through an arms embargo. This is so that this is so U.S. will stay in the Middle East and continue to give them defensive weapons. And we'll go on to why that's important on their case. Now moving on to their first contention. First extend our Rose 22 card. Diplomacy is the only thing that didn't escalate in the beginning of Russia. We see that diplomacy or that isolation is not working. Again, extend the Rose 22. Isolation through sanctions does not work through Russia. They do not touch this. The only thing they talk about is how North Korea will rebound, and the fact is that they will develop this facade. Again, you prefer our evidence that diplomacy will work in North Korea because their evidence is not specific. It has no empirics, and it has no countries where it says it. They say it does, but read their own evidence. It doesn't say any of that. And the only reason that they rebounded with their nuclear weapons is because we reinvigorated the strategy of isolationism. In the Trump era, engagement was working. They were denuclearizing. So isolation is not working. Now moving on to their second contingent of sanctions. First of all, we extend all of our cards that say smart sanctions hurt people and it compromises the public. They say that, so first of all, on Saudi Arabia defensive weapons, extend our Word 22 card is that defensive weapons they stop the war, they do not proliferate war. Second, extend Al Jazeera 2. Without defense weapons, Saudi Arabia would die. If we get the best of both worlds, Saudi Arabia gets to defend itself and it stops the war because we're not supplying them with arms weapons. And next, you say that they have conventional sanctions, but the thing is that on conventional sanctions, they can't engage and not engage at the same time. Isolation harms from extend our Gordon 10 card and our Rose 22 card. Isolation has no impact, and isolation only harms citizens. They can't say that, oh, well, we'll allow humanitarian efforts because it's isolation. Isolation hurts no matter what. And it's for the reasons that I would ask you to vote in negative.
Are y'all ready for Grand Cross?
Yeah.
Can I have the first question?
Go ahead.
You all stated that by denuclearizing, somehow that's a benefit for, I'm assuming, a decrease in human rights abuses, because that's what the resolution is about. But just because they denuclearized doesn't mean that North Korea wasn't still abusing human rights, correct?
So, okay, first of all, that's a new argument. But second of all, yeah, it is important because with engagement, we saw that not only it reintegrates them in society, so we see the human rights abuses, and it creates internal pressure.
So you saw a decrease in human rights abuses under the Trump administration with North Korea?
Because they were being being reintegrated into society. Okay, do you have a question?
Yeah, so real quick, just let's go over your contention 2 sanctions. Where are your large-scale examples of sanctions working? Of making.
So we provide the Lopez 12 evidence that shows that by smart sanctioning Gaddafi, we cut off nearly half of his monies, which resulted in the decrease in support among Libyan elites and also helped us in that situation that we had with Gaddafi. We also showed you a comprehensive study from Shagabutanova and Barajikian 07, which concluded that empirically smart sanctions are effective. Can we ask the next question?
Yeah.
So you all stated that smart sanctions didn't work in Iran, but how does that compare to our comprehensive evidence of smart sanctions working? Can you truly negate a comprehensive study based off of one example?
So specifically, the issue is that your evidence doesn't assume, or sorry, the issue is that your evidence doesn't like take into account the cost of those sanctions, specifically like the harm to the civilians. So we like maybe there's some amount of effect on reducing the authoritarianness of an authoritarian regime. However, what we're really looking at is that doesn't really outweigh the harms to the civilians, like through targeted sanctions and like smart sanctions in general. Like you essentially just end up like destroying the public sphere. Like you destroy thousands of jobs and civil servants who are there to help prevent human rights abuses.
Yeah. And
now
now,
the next question.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that was a yeah. Okay. So specifically, let's actually go over. What was it? Yeah. So let's actually go over. Oh, did you have a question? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Apparently, I don't really have a question.
okay.
So specifically, like, where's the appeasement with the Middle East? Like, where are we seeing appeasement right now, and in which ways?
I mean, so like we're talking about like historically, like appeasement, like how appeasement with like these sorts of regimes has ended up leading to like material support, signals to leadership that what they're doing is okay.
Sorry, what sorts of regimes are you talking about?
Primarily authoritarian regimes.
What regimes?
I mean, it literally gives examples in like the study, like
it didn't actually. So unless you have more like cards that's not in there, the cards you gave us didn't have any actual countries.
All right, I'm taking remaining prep. All right. Order is going to be voters. Can everyone hear me? All right. Then I will start. Their entire North Korea contention is appeasement. Here's why that is. Because we tell you specifically, in our case, we tell you in Dupree, Day, and Taylor, and the Taylor France 15 evidence about how when authoritarian regimes appear to be taking actions, they are actually continuing to bolster their own regime and continuing to bolster authoritarianism and human rights crackdowns in their country. Their evidence for their North Korea contention is they tell you about how we were moving towards denuclearization during the Trump era. Here's the thing. It appeared that they were moving towards denuclearization, but obviously, since we look at the status quo and see that they are moving back towards nuclearization, that is not what has been happening. North Korea, during the Trump administration, adopted a facade of democracy, just like we told you in the Taylor and France 15 evidence, and they appeared that they were actually working towards approving human rights conditions and denuclearization, when in fact, they were just adopting this facade of democracy in order to bolster their legitimacy on the international stage. That's the first reason why you vote for the affirmative, because we have this whole thing about how engaging with these regimes is only going to lead to crackdowns. It is only going to lead to these countries adopting a facade of democracy without actually doing anything to improve conditions in that country. But the second reason you vote for us is because we are the only side in today's debate that actually reduces humanitarian harms. We give you 3 examples of this, all in our negative incentives point, where we tell you first about like how like these smart sanctions are going to be implemented. Their only response to this is that smart sanctions against Russia don't work. There are countries other than Russia in which we have imposed smart sanctions and in which they have worked. Next, we tell you about like arms embargoes. Again, these arms embargoes like empirically work. We tell you specifically how they worked in South Sudan. Again, there are countries other than Russia in the Middle East. And finally, we tell you about like these humanitarian exceptions with conventional sanctions, which will reduce humanitarian harms. Vote AF.
My partner's going to take the rest of prep, which is, I stopped at 15 seconds left. So starting now.
Okay. Oh, sorry. New cards. Order is going to be, we'll go framework up top, and then we'll move into voters in the order of the affirmative, and then the negative case. Is everybody good? Very cool. Okay. Yep, my timer. Oops. So first on framework, we're winning because it goes unresponded. Prefer present, relevant, and case-specific instances plus examples within a net benefit paradigm. It goes unresponded means that you evaluate the round within this framework. Second, the next voter that you're voting on immediately is North Korea. They basically go, or like all of our cards go unresponded to specifically. You're also preferring all of our evidence because like they'll say appeasement. However, pull their entire doc. They're literally just citing names without an actual card. So you prefer our evidence immediately. Also, you prefer our evidence because it's case specific and not generic. Also, their evidence is all about just Havana, which isn't even a country. That's a capital in a country. That's just a city. So you prefer all of our evidence that says, like you're extending Schlein 22 here. Isolation isn't working. It's forcing North Korea to double down on human rights abuses. Engagement is the only way to reintegrate them. Also, you're extending Patterson 22. North Korea is escalating right now. Means it's try or die for the affirmative or the negative, sorry. Specifically because like if you don't do this, we'll see mass death and genocide on the Korean Peninsula. That's an immediate voter today. Let's move into Middle East. It goes practically untouched in the last speech, means that you grant 100% risk of it happening and the impact scenario. This is the story. Again, extend jury in 22. Once the United States pulls out, Russia comes back in and they fill in with their arms. The arms sales essentially allows them to revitalize their military and break the stalemate that is explained in Judah 22, which goes unresponded to. Extend Dickinson 22. This allows them to revamp the genocide in Ukraine. That's an immediate voter. And like we outweigh because we tell you like nuclear conflict and genocide are probably bigger than just generic, like maybe we help stop some human rights abuses, which they don't go into depth on the impact analysis. Move into abuse or appeasement, sorry. Again, we already responded to this and they didn't touch our Rosenpolitik 22 card, so extend those specifically on how diplomacy specific to Russia like doesn't lead to escalation and isolation through sanctions doesn't have impact on Russia, like one of the biggest authoritarian regimes. Moving to sanctions. Again, they don't respond to our turn. Engagement is key to the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. Like conditional arms are key to, we can provide defensive arms without like providing for the means to kill people and commit genocide in Yemen, which like solves and prevents destruction in Saudi Arabia, which is why you prefer the affirmative, or not the affirmative, the negative. It's one of the two.